Hey there, Vernacular Faithful. Redcoat here,
And Cedar joins him.
and we've got another podcast for you. And today's going to be a little bit different. It's another off the cuff discussion.
Yeah, but rather than like a straight up interview, this is going to just be more of a discussion back and forth as we talk about kind of the topic of designing a game world where you're intending to not have fast travel or potentially also not have a map. These are kind of a related concept. Just off the top, this is going to be talking about games that are not linear games. Linear games obviously don't really need fast travel or maps. Those are things that are navigational aids, and a linear game is like, here's where you go. It is down this hallway, or this very nice set of hallways.
Yeah, in general, with a linear game, the whole point of it is getting to the point that you're going to and getting through all of the stuff that's in your way to get there.
Yeah, they're obstacle courses rather than navigational challenges or whatever.
Yeah, so with that in mind, I think the first thing we need to poke at here is fast travel and maps as a functional tool.
Yeah, so I guess since we presented that, or let's talk about fast travel first. So, to me, fast travel is basically teleportation, right? It's some way of going from point A to point B. But I think I need to add a little bit additional here because all I've described is traversing, right?
Yeah.
So there's a difference between something like a shortcut or a link, for lack of a better phrase. So, for example, what comes to mind is in Doom, there's teleport pads. Those technically take you from one place to another, but fast travel is not just a teleport pad. It's a specific, deliberate ability to go to a specific location. So, an example of this is, say, the Lord Vessel in Dark Souls. Dark Souls 1, you get the Lord Vessel, you unlock the ability to warp to specific bonfires. Now, this is a somewhat more limited form of fast travel. Ocarina of Time also has a limited form with warp songs,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to something like Dark Souls 2 or 3, where any bonfire can take you to any bonfire that's much more open. However, there's even more open forms where you unlock specific nodes and you can just bring up some sort of like overworld map and double click on it. For example, Shadow of War slash Shadow of Mordor, once you unlock the towers, you can just pull up your map and be like, I want to warp to this tower, please. And as long as you're not in combat, off you go.
Yeah, well, it's interesting also that you bring that up, like with Shadow of War, right? Not Morder.
They both have the tower warp to mechanic.
Okay. With the map idea, because that makes me think back to the old school, some of the old school games where you have the world map and you can go back and forth between stages, and you use the map and you're like, I'm going to go here, so I'm going to do this stage, which is a bit different. Um,
Yeah, it's a bit different because these are like locations within the map.
mhm.
Like Shadow of War in particular, like Shadow of Mordor has two maps. Shadow of War has a bunch more, it has like five or six.
Yeah.
Um, and in those, you can go to different regions as well. You can fast travel to the warp points within each region. But yeah, it's the towers also serve as a respawn point.
Yeah.
One of the key things with fast travel, just talking about it just generally, is frequency. By which I mean how many locations can you fast travel to.
Yeah.
So, for example, Ocarina of Time has six.
Yeah.
Whereas, say, Shadow of War has a lot more, where each map has like three to six sort of
Hmm.
places you can fast travel to, but it's still somewhat limited. Or like Dark Souls 1 has a much more limited set of places you can fast travel to than, say, Dark Souls 3, because in Dark Souls 3 there's a lot more bonfires that are, you can go to any of them.
Yeah.
So this discussion is about designing without fast travel, or perhaps more with minimal or restricted fast travel.
Yeah.
Sort of the idea that the player can't just like warp to wherever they want to go. There are a lot of advantages to fast travel. It cuts out a lot of backtracking, for example.
Yeah, and it in general it expedites certain elements of play where now you don't have to spend time running all the way over to any particular place.
Yeah, like it's interesting actually, but like airships in old school RPGs are
Yeah,
actually kind of a slow form of fast travel.
they expedite the process
Yeah.
because it's basically not only do they usually open up more places that you can go, but it's also just I want to go here, so I'm just going to go woo, and it takes me like a few seconds as opposed to walking across the entirety of the field and going across the specific bridges to get to where you need to go.
Yeah. Actually, Tales of Symphonia had that sort of thing going on too.
Yeah,
which is interesting because it is kind of like a form of fast travel. Actually, flying in Pokemon is another form of fast travel.
Yeah, well, that's expressly that because you can go anywhere that you want to or need to go by flying, pretty much.
Well, you can just go to towns that you've visited, but the laddie in the was it Omega Ruby Alpha
Mhm.
Sapphire?
Yeah,
Um, those ones, I believe you could get a Latios or Latios, and that would allow you to kind of do a flying fast travel thing that's a lot more.
a lot more similar to
Yeah, that gives you a lot more options.
yeah. Well, it's interesting. So when thinking about since we've talked a little bit about the advantages that are granted by fast travel, so what happens when you don't have it, and what are good things that come from that? Because obviously we know that the bad is you have to spend time getting anywhere,
Right, not having fast travel. But what are the benefits of not having fast travel?
and
Right.
like one of the things that comes with this is that to do this you have to have a very strong environmental design. I think
I agree.
because without an environment that is engaging to pass through and repeatedly engageable really, then not having that fast travel, it becomes way more apparent and the player gets bored very quickly.
Yeah, so you definitely want to be very conscientious about map size and how the map connects together. The advantages is that I think you can make a stronger, more compelling world. Um, Dark Souls 3 has a lot of really well designed zones,
Yeah,
but the height of Dark Souls world design is still considered to be the first one. And part of the reason for this is everywhere up through Anor Londo, right, in the game, because that world is super interconnected. And so it creates a sense of discoverability when you find a shortcut. Like when you get to the Undead Parish and then you find the elevators that take you back down to Firelink Shrine and the
yeah,
world suddenly locks into place, connects better. That moment of discovery of sort of I'm back to a familiar place as the world turns in on itself is really compelling. It's a very powerful emotional moment.
yeah, because that's something that also the original Super Metroid kind of did as well. The idea that you have to get anywhere, you have to go there. And the more things you gain throughout the game, the more new pathways and new explorations that you can embark upon. And so it makes navigation an additional skill to the game, like understanding and remembering the environments and being like, oh, that thing that I saw back then, I can affect that now. I need to get back over there and let's check that out.
Yeah. And there's actually something else that's really key. Fast travel, depending upon how it's implemented, but it gives the player an escape,
Yeah.
right? So, for anybody who's ever gone to Tomb of the Giants, pre Lord Vessel,
Mm-hmm.
it is a commitment to sit at a bonfire down there.
Yeah, because now you're down there. You are in there for the long haul.
Yeah, you have to get yourself back out. So, like, if you could just fast travel out of there, it's not as much of a commitment, but it's also like you don't feel trapped, right? And perhaps you don't want the player to feel trapped, but if you want to be able to create those moments, the player is like, I'm trapped here. I just have to find out how to get out of here,
Yeah.
right? Then fast travel gives them a way out, and you might not want that. So, depending upon what you're going for with some of the mechanical aesthetics of your game, you may want to consider something of like, yeah, no, you're stuck. You can't leave.
Yeah, because that makes me think too the Resident Evil games, specifically Resident Evil 2, because that's the one I played the most.
Yeah, horror games would probably not want fast travel.
Yeah, because fast travel it immediately detenses certain things because now anytime you say you have limited amounts of things that you can carry, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a part of the skill in any particular exploration game that has limited wares is remembering where you left things before and knowing I'm probably going to need to go back here, so I need to leave this here so that I can pick it up later. And so always having your stashes all over the world and just being like I am prepared for whatever's happening even though it's not with me right now.
Mm-hmm. There are some important considerations, by the way, when designing a world without fast travel. I already said that the world should you need to be very conscious about world size,
Yeah.
but also just creating ways for the player to navigate,
Mm-hmm.
and then also being very conscious of hubs. So, for example, Ocarina of Time has Lost Woods shortcuts,
Yeah.
as well as the shortcut from Lake Hylia, when you're a kid anyway, from Lake Hylia to Zoro's Domain. Those connections allow you to be able to get through the world more rapidly, more
Yeah.
quickly. It's interesting, too, how they can also create senses of isolation, by which I mean the connection in the Lost Woods taking you to Goron City and therefore easy access to Kakariko Village or Death Mountain areas, as well as the one to Zoro's Domain.
Mm-hmm.
These kind of leave off the whole Gerudo area of the map.
Yeah, and so that area feels especially isolated from everywhere else.
Yeah. But at the same time, that river is a one-way trip to Lake Hylia,
Mm-hmm.
which means that there's connections there. This sort of thing helps the world feel more cohesive potentially as well, but you do want to make sure that you're intentional about it. You also want to be really intentional about hub areas. So a hub area is naturally going to be a place where there's a lot of pathways. And sort of the need for being conscientious about this, of how you're designing it, what you're filling it with, how getting through it feels, is really important, but also making traveling through it interesting. By which I mean, like, if I come from point A and I'm going to point B, it should feel different than going from point B to point A, or point A to point C, or point C to point B, or B to C, that sort of thing, where
Yeah.
which direction you're going through it makes a difference for how you're approaching navigating the area.
Yeah, I mean that's one that I think again Dark Souls does phenomenally well. At least in its earlier zones, like the starting zone in particular, just from how you pass through it in any particular point of the game. Like returning to it from the cathedral and coming out near where coming out where Petrus is, and then when you
Yeah,
come,
you're talking about Firelink.
yeah, Firelink Shrine.
Yeah, I think that's Petrus.
Yeah, coming out there and then realizing that you're back at the main back at that first fire, or when you come when you the fact that you can go down to the Valley of the Drakes from there and reach other points, and it's the fact that you can happen upon depending on how you're going through the game, you can happen upon different areas and different ways of different places just from exploring that area differently.
Yeah, there's some areas that tend to be specifically major hubs of like passageway. So like the Undead Parish area where Andre the Blacksmith is.
Yeah.
It's a really good idea for him to be there because it's got access to a number of different directions that you want to go.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also like that one first bonfire in the Undead Burg in sort of that area leading up to like the Taurus Demon. That area is really useful because it gives you access up the ladder later to the bridge area
where the dragon is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
but it also gives you a quick access to the shortcut to the Undead Burg area.
Oh, forgive me, air quotes dragon. It's actually not a
like
dragon.
a wyvern hellcat or whatever.
Thing. What it blows fire.
It's close enough.
Yeah.
But there is actually an area that I'm kind of disappointed wasn't more of a hub, which is the Darkroot Garden area.
Yeah.
That area has a number of connections going on with it, but really it's kind of like around the periphery. And if that area had been an area that traversed more, I think it would have been beneficial to the Cat Covenant.
Overall design, yeah.
Well, it would have been particularly beneficial to the Cat Covenant, because if you incentivize players to travel through that area a lot,
yeah, that's true, because you didn't really have to go through there if you wanted to get anywhere.
No, you didn't.
And if it did connect to more places, like if there was some way to get to the Ashwoods from there, well, not the Ashwoods, it's the...
You're thinking of the Ash Lake.
The Ash Lake. I'm sorry, my terminology is off. It's been a very long time since I played it.
Yeah, but it's just one of those things where if you think about what do you want the player to be doing in an area, and if you make an area intentionally a hub area, like the Lost Woods actually works as a bit of a thoroughfare in Ocarina of Time,
yeah,
because of those shortcuts between Zoro's Domain, and in particular the one to Goron City, just because it's so useful to be able to go from one place to the other, especially since you can get Minuet of the Forest very early. This is another thing that's really important, is when you have limited fast travel like this, you want to think about where are the branching spokes from this fast travel location.
Yeah.
So, for example, Minuet of the Forest gets you into the Lost Woods, which easily gets you to Kokiri Forest, but it also easily gets you to Goron City or near Zoro's Domain. So, in some regards, that single song because of the way Lost Woods is set up, it becomes a very significant form of fast travel because it gives you easy access to that thoroughfare. It's kind of like an on-ramp to a highway. And uh, when you're looking at Dark Souls 1, for example, where you get the Lord Vessel and then you get to warp to specific locations, it reinforces things like Andre being a hub by having the Undead Parish be a warp bonfire.
Yeah.
So just things like that can be significant for setting that sort of stuff up, or is like a specific thing you want to take into mind or be a consideration.
Another element to really be keeping in mind when if you're considering removing fast travel from your game, or considering like, should we have this, is traveling in of itself a fun aspect of the game?
Yeah.
Because that's one of the things that the Spider-Man open world games really benefited from, and it's another aspect of, while I do believe they have limited elements of fast travel in them, specifically the infamous games and trying to remember the other one came out at the same time. Anyways, um, with those superhero open world games, which is basically what they are,
Yeah.
one of the things that they really try and emphasize is that being the hero and getting from point A to point B is a fun experience in of itself. Like even
Mm-hmm.
Hulk Ultimate Destruction, even though you don't have a swinging power, you have Hulk jump and jumping from going from building to building and jamming your fists into them to climb up them and stuff like that.
Yeah. No, this goes back to an idea that I have about making movement engaging, right?
Yeah.
Or because an open field where you don't have any ability to influence how quickly you move across it is extremely boring to navigate.
Yeah.
Right? There's nothing interesting happening. But if you have movement skills, even something as simple as Dark Souls, hold down the run button and manage your stamina, it creates some level of interest, even just a baseline,
Yeah.
that greatly helps. And so something like, say, I guess Spider-Man 2 or any of those Spider-Man open world games, or like Batman Arkham City,
where you can glide and everything.
yeah, where you have the zip rope and the gliding and all that sort of stuff. Like things that make navigation interesting. So there's two skills related to navigation. The first one is actually doing the movement between point A and point B. And making that interesting helps tremendously. And that's very, very useful. But another thing that can be quite beneficial is knowing how to get around, be a skill that the player can take pride in.
Yeah.
So that's like, again, going back to Ocarina of Time because it's easy in my mind, but knowing how to get from, say you're in, I don't know, Lake Hylia and you want to get to Kakariko Village, what's the fastest way to get there? Well, if you're a kid, it might be go to Zoro's domain, into the Lost Woods, over to the warp to the Goron City, and out through Goron City.
Mm-hmm.
And like having a sense of how to route can be a skill that can be very fun and engaging.
Yeah, because that's another thing that Dark Souls does really well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because the very idea of making a character, because when I play the games, I always play it with a specific character mindset in mind of like I'm going to be a magician or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
But the different needs that your character has determines what routes you want to take throughout the game. And so having a knowledge of the geometry of the world and how things interconnect becomes a skill because you immediately plot out I'm going to go here and then I'm going to cut through this area, which saves me time and puts me at this point where I get this item, which allows me to get to this way, and you get this whole routing plan where you want to go.
Something else actually that I thought of that's really worth bringing up in this discussion is having fast travel means that your players might skip stuff. They might skip points of engagement.
Yeah.
So not having fast travel means that your player is going to re-encounter specific things potentially.
Yeah.
So like in Dark Souls, you're going to have the same set of enemies that you're going to run into.
Yeah.
This allows the player to be able to accumulate additional resources. So if you have fast travel, you have to consider what happens because the player isn't doing as much backtracking.
Yeah. Because they don't pass through an area on a repeated basis. Because this is actually a core part of certain design of RPGs, actually, where they know that you need to be at a certain level to fight a boss. So they put an expanse of land between you and the next mission or zone. which means that there is a very high chance that you're going to encounter a certain amount of battles, which means that you will gain a certain amount of XP.
Yeah, and that'll prepare you for it. Or, again, you can potentially run into equipment that you need that way, or other things that you run into because, or a really good example actually is something like, say, a Metroid game,
Yeah.
where if you don't have fast travel and you have to go through a zone, you might be like, oh, right, there was a thing here that I can now interact with that I couldn't before.
Yeah. Because if you just had the ability to fast travel, you wouldn't have that opportunity to notice.
Yeah, so you might miss something.
And that's a big part of designing a game without fast travel is just that aspect. One aspect to me is just the interest of the world itself, making sure that there is a lot to notice and there's a lot to see. And so combing across it multiple times is interesting.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is you want to make it so that way it doesn't feel like backtracking to the player,
Yeah.
per se.
I know in the superhero games, and I'm also going to count, what was it? Purple Aesthetic, you're a gangster.
Saints Row.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, it's particularly Saints Row 4 when you had superpowers.
Yes, yeah, Saints Row 4 is particularly superhero-esque.
Very Matrixy, too.
Yeah, it's a fun game. But one of the things that's particularly interesting about those games is that you do a lot of traversal, but at least in a lot of the superhero games, you get this thing of where people call out for help all the time. And you can randomly come across citizens in trouble, and you're like, I'm going to go help them because that's what I'm doing. I'm on patrol.
Yeah, no, you can absolutely do stuff like that, where you can pop up stuff to engage in because there's, like, things here, right?
Yeah.
So it's making sure that there's points of engagement while the player is, getting from point A to point B.
And it also makes me think a little bit of Yakuza, actually, although it's a much smaller world than most of the ones that we've talked about, because it's basically just I believe it's Shibuya district. I don't quote me on that.
I'm not going to be able to help you.
But yeah, it's a part of Japan. It's a city in Japan, and basically, the area is just extremely detailed. There are almost all of the buildings you can kind of go into, and they all have their own little mini games and events in them. Like you can play remote control cars in certain of them. You can play a not a grab me gotcha game, the crane games.
Oh, those things.
Yeah, and all through you can wander through town and find all sorts of things. You can play mahjong in that game. But there's all sorts of just random things that you can run into, and every time you go through the city, you might find something new. And of course, to keep things a little bit fresh as you're walking around, enemies will just show up. And like one of my favorite quests in that game was Maijima Everywhere, he's this guy that in the past you were considered to be stronger than him, and he just loved the fact that you could beat the crap out of him because nobody else could beat him up.
Ah.
And then you go into jail for a while, you lose your skills, and when you come out, he's like, I can beat the crap out of you easily. I don't like this. I don't like this at all. You need to get your skills up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to randomly ambush you at random points. And you're going to have to fight me and get better so that you can beat my ass again.
That's funny.
Yeah. But, yeah, that's the...
It makes me think a little bit of the... Yakuza? I forget exactly what they're called. But the evil Sheikah tribe in Breath of the Wild.
Oh, yeah. They're just like, hello! Beat the crap out of you now. Get better. Get good.
Yeah, I keep wanting to call them Yuga, but that's the villain in A Link Between Worlds. Anyway, so all of this stuff does have a lot of connections to not having maps.
Yeah.
And when we say maps, we mean like a GPS system.
Yeah, a guidance system that says go here, go there. And so you don't have to do any of the memory or engagement with the world around you.
Or even just like, you're here and here's everything about the world around you, right? Where you're spending more time looking at the map and where you're going rather than
the world looking at the world around you and finding your way through it. It's like that old adage, the way a man figures out where he's at is to get lost in it.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's different levels of that sort of thing. Like, I think to Doom, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And Doom has a map, and you can have it follow you.
Yeah.
So you can navigate by it, but you cannot see anything because it's just lines.
Ah.
And so, like, yes, technically you can navigate with a map, but it's mostly useful for figuring out where you are and where you're trying to go.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like, a real world map where you don't have a position on. I mean, a lot of us today are familiar with something like a GPS system,
Yeah.
which can position where you're at, but using satellites and other technologies. And a lot of games have this sort of functionality in it. But it's like the level of detail of like how much can you just navigate the world by looking at this map?
Yeah, that comes to the idea of landmarks and just
Mm-hmm.
the variability of your world. Like the most recent Spider-Man game is one of those places is one of those worlds that you can actually be you can say I am in this district because the buildings are different. The way the skyline looks is different. Like there's actual functional detail to just how the world is constructed so that you know where you're at.
That sort of thing's really important. Things that allow you to be able to identify where you're at, what's going on, and that sort of thing. Um, and this is where it's really important to have aesthetic differences, but it's also really important to have um, mechanical differences. And what I mean by that is not something like super elaborate, but just like this area has different topography.
Yeah, different topography. It requires you to traverse it differently, perhaps.
Yeah. So, like, for example, Dark Souls has the depths, which feels one particular way, but also is arranged in a particular way. Like, again, something that's really great about Dark Souls and why it's really good to look at is because it is a world where a lot of care has been taken to the construction of it. And so different areas have different aesthetics, but they also have very different mechanical designs. They have different emphases on how you're engaging with that zone.
Yeah.
So, like, the depths is a bunch of narrow hallways, right? It's functionally kind of similar in some regards to Blighttown, except it's enclosed and Blighttown's open.
Mm-hmm.
And Blighttown uses verticality and fall damage to control your navigation rather than straight up walls. But the walls are there, you just can see through them, sort
Yeah.
of thing. And so, like, that creates a different sort of sense. And then it's also just making sure that areas aren't so big and so bland that you kind of get lost in them.
Yeah.
Now, any game that you spend enough time in, you're going to be able to learn how to navigate in. And that's definitely, like,
That's just a fact of life
yeah.
because of how we're constructed. We will remember the things that we engage with. That's just how it works.
But things like not having fast travel or having very limited fast travel where you kind of go through in multiple directions can make an area seem bigger than it is,
Yeah.
or can give you a greater sense of the space.
Mm-hmm.
If you've never done it before, go into like Dark Souls 3, for example, which kind of encourages going through the levels in a very specific way. And just try going backwards.
And see what happens.
Yeah, because it becomes a different experience. Um, so
Well, I feel like we've covered a lot of different concepts here, but I think we want to get back to that core concept that we were digging at, which is just like so you can design a world without fast travel, and you can also design a world without maps. And the basic concept here being that these are conveniences that make things faster and more efficient for players, but there are experiences that can only be had without them.
yeah, and the emphasis is on navigation, right? It's on the player's navigation skills, both in figuring out where they are, where they're going, and figuring out how to get there.
Yeah, and I think the one of my big things when deciding, whether or not you're going to put it in there, I think is that concept of when you're putting your player into that world, do you want them to, for lack of a better term, essentially live in it, or do you want them to just kind of they go in for a while and do some things, and then they don't have to attach any particular part of their mind to it? Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Well, it's how much is the game playing itself for them is part of what's going on, particularly with maps.
Yeah,
Right.
It's the idea that if a game is about exploration, then you want the player to explore. And it becomes a question of, is it more about just finding the place the first time and then we never really want to do that again? Or is it more about learning about the gestalt of the place itself and learning and continually finding new things within the spaces that you're crossing?
Yeah. So I think for me, some of the big important things to take away is fast travel is perfectly fine. It's not a bad thing. Maps are not a bad thing. These are things that can be great to have, but understand why you're having them in your game. And there's also, I think, an important question to ask when you're having, in particular, fast travel, is why do you feel that you need it? Is your game too big? Is your modes of transportation too slow? Is movement too unengaging? Like, these are problems that you should address regardless of whether or not you have fast travel. So, for example, Breath of the Wild is a very big game, and it does have fast travel. You unlock shrines, you can fast travel to them.
Yeah.
However, it also has a horse,
Mm-hmm.
and the horse moves pretty quickly. It's also really beautiful to look at.
It also has gliding.
It also has gliding. That's a lot of fun.
Like, there's a lot of different ways to traverse the terrain in that game, and
Yeah.
at fairly fast clips.
Yeah, for sure. And like one of the DLCs adds a motorbike.
Yeah, that
That thing's fun.
comes out of left field if you ask me, but I won't deny that it's fun.
Yeah, I mean it's very nice, and it also has a teleporting horse that you can get, so that way you can actually have your horse with you after you've climbed up the mountain and over the other side. But like my point is they have fast travel in that game, but they've also addressed the underlying reasons why you would potentially need fast travel. Of like, is it really boring to go these vast distances? Well, they've added stuff to increase your movement speed in the form of like a horse or a motorcycle. They've done things like making sure that navigation is fun with like gliding and climbing and things like that.
They've also made it so that the process of traveling through the world can give you resources where you find ingredients for the different things that you can cook, or you find different the weapons that you will eventually break.
So the basic point is like fast travel helps that game. It does, because it is a large world, and sometimes you do want to get from one side to the other. But they also made it a game where it's fun to just hop on your horse or your motorcycle and ride from one end to the other as well.
Yeah, well, it comes back to the core intent that they were going for on the game, and this is my inference, and also from just reading a lot of the stuff about what they were going for. They wanted to get back to what the original Legend of Zelda was like, where it was you were kind of set out there and you poked around and found the stuff that you needed to. It was to simulate the idea of playing in your backyard and finding new and interesting things. So the core concept of exploration is a big part of the game.
Yeah.
So making that in of itself fun, while still having the fast travel to expedite the extremely long distances that you'll have to go,
Mm-hmm.
was I feel that was a very good decision.
Yeah. So I guess kind of the warning here is to make sure that you're not using fast travel as a crutch to cover up bad design, because your bad design might come through in the end.
Yeah, bad design is bad design.
Yeah. So anyway, I think those are mostly our thoughts on it. I will say that the biggest danger with maps, and the reason why I thought it was worth bringing up, at least for me personally, is because of the navigating by looking at your compass problem.
Yeah, where you stop looking at the world around you.
Yeah. And that one is much trickier to deal with at times. But
Yeah.
it's just making sure that the player can figure out how to get to where they're trying to go without having to stare at the map, and that there's enough stuff going on in the world that they want to look at it.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we've gone in on this one for a fairly long while. So.
Yep, I think we've probably been pretty thorough. So join us next time for the conclusion to Season 2. Until then, this is Ciantier, signing off.
And this is Redcoat, signing off. Play the games you want to play, boyos.